see you. You've been in this market for decades, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fortunately or unfortunately. So how do you see the market evolving? Where you see the market is heading to in terms of solving the challenges and the problems that you already see in the market?
First of all, I think the HR role and profession itself is being elevated tremendously in every size company, small, medium, and large, because more and more of the business models that are being created in the digital world are people-centric or service-centric. So companies need more software people, they need more engineers, they need more analysts, but they also need more service people. We're doing business 24/7, and all of those service-related businesses that all of our clients are in are running 24/7 now because they're interconnected to their customers. So the people aspects of engaging people, training people, developing people, leading people are huge, which has elevated HR. The second thing that's really elevated HR is this change in the relationship between the employer and the employer. Mm-hmm. You know, we used to have this, and I like to call it the untethering of the relationship between the employee and the employer. It used to be, certainly when I got out of college, you hitched yourself to a company and that was it. That was your career. Now your career is independent of your employer. So certainly the high potential people are saying, well, this is a good company. What am I going to get out of this place? And how long am I going to stay? And when it doesn't feel like it's the right step in my career anymore, I'm just going to move over here to this other place. And maybe I'll do a little work on the side too. So that's really raised the bar for HR. How do we attract and retain and manage those people?
And it didn't happen before, right?
Well, I mean, no, because we used to have these big companies that really took care of people. Corporations used to be benevolent employers, and they used to give you all sorts of benefits and career management, career growth, but that all kind of went away, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, you know, when we started to globalize. The third thing that's been really revolutionary is that all of the management practices of hierarchical top-down leadership are going away. And I think the best example of that is what happened to GE. Jack Welch wrote many of the books on how to lead, how to manage, how to do performance management. They were the ones who developed all the general managers that went out into all these other companies. And now you look at what's happened to GE, and you know, I don't know anything, you know, specific about what's under the covers. Those management principles are not working anymore. So we have to manage people in teams. We have to manage the organization as a network. You know, the word that you guys like to use, which I love, is tribes. People gravitate towards small groups of people that they know well. There's lots of research on this, on the human nature of our relationships. We spend more time with people we're physically close to, that we get to know in projects. And we didn't build enough HR practices and processes and systems to facilitate that yet. So there's a reinvention of the technology industry going on to try to facilitate all these changes. And so the fourth thing I would mention is that is the HR tech market. And you know, the HR tech industry is harder than it looks. It's much more complicated.
I must admit, yeah.
But I think the fact that you guys came to market not having a deep domain expertise in HR is a benefit. It's an advantage to you because you looked at it from the standpoint of what does a manager really need, what does an employee really need to be effective and engaged in a company today, and you built something that does that. And under the covers, it's doing all the stuff that the HR system needs to do. And the HR technology market is you know, hundreds of billions of dollars and filled with products. And I think there's a big upheaval. I call it a disruption, that if the systems are not useful to employees and managers, and they're not helping you get your work done, and helping you feel involved and develop yourself, you're like, why am I using this? I mean, I'm only going to use it if I have to, but if I don't have to, I'm not going to use it at all. And so, you know, the people that are buying those systems have to be careful. If they buy a system that looks good to the HR manager, it still may fail. Because if the employees don't like it, you're not going to be happy with the results. So there's a new generation of, and it's not just the user interface. The other thing is, it's interesting, when I first saw Bob, what appealed to me, and I instantly got this, wasn't just the user interface. It was the fact that it was designed to be useful to the things that you do every day at work. Some of that is HR related, some of that's not. And that's a different way of thinking about the problem. And I think all of the HR vendors are starting to come to grips with that and figure out how to build systems that are, not just systems of engagement, but systems of collaboration or systems of teamwork or systems of connection that really bring your work, into a better light for you as an individual. And those are the things I think you guys are really starting to figure out.
And you spend most of your career advising big corporation, big enterprise, right? Tens of thousands of employees. But the majority of the market are smaller companies or medium-sized companies.
Right.
So I have a question about the fast-growing companies. Those who start the journey and they hired 100 or 200 people, and then all of a sudden they have to grow the people. They have to triple the size of the company. Do you see any specific challenges related to fast-growing companies? And a good example coming from high-tech companies or media companies. How do you see them?
I think fast-growing companies have the biggest challenge and maybe have the most opportunity for innovation in all of the HR and talent areas. When you're growing fast, if you're not a great place to work, if you don't have a great value proposition, if you're not clear on what the job's going to be, if people don't like their managers, you're not going to do it. You're not going to get there from here, especially if you're in tech. So tech companies have some of the most advanced, innovative talent practices of any, and you don't have to be a big company. Some of the most innovative ideas that have come out of HR, like the idea of the employee experience, came from Airbnb when Airbnb was a small company. It was the idea of taking the guest experience that they gave to their guests and bring it to their employees. And that idea has now taken off like a wildfire. The idea of continuous performance management, which everybody is now kind of dealing with, started in small companies.
And what about the fast developing employees working for fast growing companies? So it's even more complex than before.
Well, yeah, and I think in the areas of, in this issue of developing people and learning, has completely been revolutionized in the last 5 or 6 years, again, by small companies who didn't want to wait for a training department to spend 5 years to build a course on whatever it is somebody needed to learn. People went out on the internet and just taught themselves, and now we have a new generation of solutions there too. So I think the small, and I would say the tolerance for failure of HR in a small company is low. You can't afford to blow it when you're growing fast if your HR function isn't doing good things. And most CEOs and founders of small companies figure this out pretty quickly. Even if they've never been a CEO before, they suddenly realize, gee, I can't hire the right people. These people aren't getting along with each other. We're not getting any work done. And it's all about how the people are being managed, and that oftentimes falls back on HR. So I think it's some of the most dynamic opportunities for HR in small, medium-sized companies.
Peter Drucker said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And I like this phrase.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? I think it reflects something about the future of HR or the HCM industry.
Well, yeah, the word culture has become quite a buzzword in HR, certainly during my period of time as an analyst. And, everybody defines it a little bit differently, but there's no question that if you want to build a great company, you need to think and talk about your culture a lot. Now, I'm not saying there's one culture that's for everybody. There are companies that are very developmental and collaborative and nice. There's cultures that are very hard-hitting and competitive and growth-oriented. There's cultures that are very well-meaning and purposeful. And so I think every company has their own culture. What's important is to understand what it is and take advantage of it in your employment brand, and make sure that you're listening to the employees so you don't have subcultures growing up that are dysfunctional with the culture that the company has. And oftentimes the CEO brings a culture. In fact, usually the culture starts with the founders.
Yes.
And the CEO reinforces it. And I think there are periods of time where the CEO needs to rethink whether the culture they brought to the company is the right one anymore. Yeah. And that's usually when there's some sort of an upset, and sometimes a new CEO or the board comes in and gives the CEO some coaching. So I couldn't agree more. You know, and HR professionals who've been around the block understand that you know, it isn't enough to just roll out a new program for performance management or comp or whatever it may be. If it doesn't fulfill and reinforce the culture, it's not going to be effective. Mm-hmm. So I absolutely agree with that.
And you know, the HCM industry is full of hundreds of vendors. If I'm not mistaken, hundreds of them, you know, 600 or 1,000.
Oh, I have 1,400 in my database.
1,400.
Yeah, but I think more. I'm missing a lot.
So if you were advising an entrepreneur who is really anxious about starting up a company in HR tech, what would be your advice to somebody?
To getting into HR tech?
Yes.
I would, well, I mean, I think there's two different types of companies that get into HR tech. There are people like you who are great entrepreneurs who see the opportunity and they jump in with a great idea and they don't always know what they're getting into.
Yeah.
And they realize it's more complicated than they thought and it's more competitive than they thought. But they usually come up with something that nobody ever thought of before. And some of those companies are wildly successful. But the challenge of selling into HR is the sales, the marketing, the positioning, because it's a noisy space. Even though it's a gigantic market, there's a lot of noise. The second category of entrepreneur are people that have been in the HR tech in another company, and they know exactly what's missing. They see a little hole, you know, especially in recruiting. There's a lot of companies that do this. They'll build a product that fills this gap, and then they'll sell it. They'll sell the company. There's tons of those.
And they're all in one.
They're all over the place. So the problem for an HR buyer is making sense of all the noise. With 1,400 companies, you're going to go to a trade show and get completely confused as to what to buy. So what I try to recommend is find a company that is targeted on customers like you. So, you know, buy things from a company that have sold to companies just like you. So if you're a fast-growing tech company, you know, like where you guys go after fast-growing companies, you would be a good fit. Try to find a vendor that has good references. I mean, the sales guys are always great and the demos are great, but you got to talk to the references because this stuff doesn't always work exactly the way it's planned. It's all about the implementation and support. And make sure the company has some money, because a lot of these companies have been started up with $2-3 million, and then, you know, there's actually 5 people behind the scenes, and anything could happen. They could get acquired, they could go out of business, they could just shut down, and then you're stuck. So, you know, take a look at who's behind them.
What's your thought about analytics and data? And, you know, again, it's you can call it buzzwords as well. But I think you're already seeing it coming into the HR tech. What do you think about the impact of data in this industry?
Well, you know, I've been doing, you know, because I'm an engineer and I first got into HR thinking about data, I've been going to conferences about analytics for, you know, 15 years. And in the early days, there would be a half a dozen or 2 dozen geeky people in HR complaining about the fact that nobody cares about what they do. The analysts, the analytics guys. Now, everybody knows that without good data, they can't manage their company well, and they need people data. So there have been floods of tools and solutions developed by vendors to deliver analytics. The problem is, most of them are developed for analysts. So if you're an analyst like me, it's great. You can go in there and run all sorts of reports and figure out what's going on, but, you know, that's a teeny tiny group of people. What about the managers, the executives, the recruiters, the line leaders who don't have time or the interest in clicking around looking for things, and they need to know, I've got a retention problem in this group, I've got somebody who's behind on their goals, I've got a diversity problem that I'm overpaying the men versus the women in these jobs. That data needs to come to you. And so we need systems like the one you guys do this, that it's now called narrative analytics is one of the names for it, but that actually give the information directly to the user, the manager or the employee, in a way that they can make sense of it instantaneously and take advantage of it. That's a different kind of problem than building a nice database and putting a UI on top of it so people can run reports. And I would say we're in the early days of that. And one of the things that you're doing that I think is very exciting at Hibob is also bringing in engagement data, organizational networking data, as well as transactional data into those recommendations. And that's going to be and then we're going to be able to give people nudges and suggestions, sort of like what your phone does. Every now and then your phone gives you some really intelligent piece of information that you didn't know you needed. I think that's a new area of it. That's really where analytics is going. And I think innovations like what you guys are doing is right on.
What about because of what you said about data? How do you see the future of HR? The position. Do you see the same type of individual that we used to see in the past 10, 20 years, or it has to be somebody with different background, with different capabilities, to be able to manage systems and to be able to interact with C-level and employees in a very dynamic environment? How do you see the future of HR, the position?
Well, that's a good question because I'm working on building an academy for HR, and that's one of the things I've been thinking a lot about. I would say there's absolutely a raise in expectations of the capabilities needed to be a great HR person, and I think they fall into kind of four categories. One is you got to know the basics of HR. There's a lot of things that just are HR disciplines, how to do a behavioral interview, how to hire people, laws that you just need to know the basics. Somebody's got to know that stuff. The second is you have to be able to understand and interpret data. If you're uncomfortable with a spreadsheet, if you don't understand a mean or a median or the basics of what a sample size, you're not going to be comfortable in HR anymore. The third is I think you need to have some sense of design and innovation in your blood, because we're not in a world where you're going to pick up an HR solution and just implement it. You're going to implement it and you're going to buy a product like Hibob, and then you're going to say, well, let's see, but in our company we have 5 different versions of this because we have different groups in different parts of the world. So how can we create it or design it in a way that's a little bit different? So you're going to have a little bit of creativity, whereas a lot of HR people are more administrators. And I think the fourth area is business acumen. You're not going to be a good HR person if you don't understand how the company makes money, what you sell, who you compete against, who are the right people to hire because of the business you're in. So you need to have some fundamental business background. And I don't think enough HR people have MBAs or backgrounds in accounting. I mean, some of these things that I learned, kind of later in life, you just have to know. So I think those 4 things are all requirements. And people come into the HR profession from different places. Sometimes they get thrown in there because we needed somebody to do it. And, you were the finance person, now you're the HR person. Maybe you were a recruiter and now you're running the whole talent acquisition function, or you were a trainer and now you're running the whole HR department. So you come into it from different places, and I think you have to develop all 4 of those capabilities. And as I mentioned, that's one of the things I'm going to be working on, is trying to make that easier for HR professionals.
Yeah. We talked about it earlier, and I shared that when we go to market, about 50 to 60% of our clients, and I'm talking about companies with 100, 200, even 700 or 1,000 employees, still running the people on Excel spreadsheets or what we call the HR spaghetti.
Yeah.
So different type of tools or features that they use. Do you see that changing in the near future? The need for ATM will shift from a nice to have to a must have. How do you see the shift?
Well, and I think this speaks to the value proposition of Hibob. you can run a company without, you need a payroll system. You got to pay people.
Yeah.
You can run a company without an HCM system. And if you're a good manager, you're going to be okay. I mean, there's going to be some running around and some, inefficiencies. But if people know what their jobs are and managers know what their jobs are and you hire good people, you're going to be okay for, 30, 50, 100 people. And the problem with the HR tech market is most of the tools that you buy for a small, medium-sized company feel like administrative overhead. There's a lot of work to use them. The HR department might get a big kick out of setting them up, and then the employees don't find them all that useful. And so we're in a wave of consumerizing this stuff so that the small companies can buy them and they don't feel like they're slowing them down. Because the last thing you want to do as a small company is buy a piece of software and you spend 6 months getting everybody to use it, and you're growing too fast. You don't have time for that. And so I think the ROI of some of those tools is not clear yet. One of the reasons I got so attracted to you guys is when I saw Bob the first time, it immediately hit me, this is a tool I would have used to run my company, immediately, as a CEO or a manager, not as an HR person. And so I think that the new generation of tools, certainly like what you guys are doing, is reaching that point where small, medium-sized companies can buy something and they will use it. You'd be amazed at the number of small, medium companies who buy something and then it sits around and they pay for it, and they never get a lot of return out of it. And then, eventually they get big enough that they replace it. And I think that's a danger of getting involved in this stuff when you're small. But I think you guys have an example of a product that I think really, really adds value for a small company.
So why do you think Hibob is nailing it, and why we are heading the right direction to the other one?
Well, I have this very sort of interesting career where I get to meet a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of tech people and a lot of CEOs, and I have a little bit of a sixth sense when I meet people. And Ronni, when I met you, I just had a feeling you got it, because you were bringing a lot of technology experience and operational experience, which is also missing in a lot of software companies too, to a very clear management focus on why we want to build something that makes it easier to manage a fast-growing company. Building things that are beautiful and useful and easy to use, it's very hard to do that well. And you guys are doing that. And you clearly, I don't know exactly how you do it under the covers. There's probably a design process and so forth going on there, but I could tell from the system when I first saw it that there's something here I hadn't seen before. Most of the vendors in the space start with processes and transactions, and then they put something pretty on top of it. You, I think about the actual management behaviors and practices, and then go back and figure out what needs to be built. And I think that's a very different way of solving the problem. I'm an independent analyst, and I talk to lots of vendors, but the reason I'm high on Hibob and Bob is because I do think the market is missing systems that are actually useful for workers, for employees, for managers, for leaders. I think we've got lots of tools that are useful for HR, and that's part of the problem. But the bigger part of the problem is, will people use it in the flow of work? And I have this sort of concept I've been writing about for the last year about in the flow of work. We have this funny thing going on in the economy. We've got economic growth all over the world. We've got low unemployment in a lot of countries. Challenges with employee engagement, very hard to hire really top people, lots of job mobility and people moving from company to company. They don't want systems that are hard to use. They're just not going to use them. Nobody has tolerance for that, especially the millennials and the Gen Z. They grew up with consumerized phone devices that if they're not useful in about 3 seconds, they just delete it off their phone. So you're not going to give them an HR system and force them to use it. The only reason they'll use it if they need to get their expense check. Otherwise, they won't touch it. So, and you don't want to be forcing your employees to use systems. That's not the right kind of relationship to have. So I think Bob is useful and kind of fun. And my sense from what I've seen in the customers that I've talked to is that it actually is an enjoyable, useful system for employees. And that's a big breakthrough. And so I give you guys a lot of credit for that.
And can you talk a little bit about the agility?
The fundamental principle behind HR software is the corporate hierarchy and the job model. And long before I got involved in this space, people were coming up with data models for that. And so the system was always designed around who are you, what is your job, what is your level, what department are you in, who's your boss, what's your reporting structure, and all of the business processes were designed around that. And very few companies actually operate like that. They look like that on paper, but the real work experience is I'm working on this project, on this team, with these people right now, and then 6 months from now I'm working on this other thing, and maybe I'm doing 2 or 3 other things at the same time, and I'm going to move from, maybe I'm going to work from home right now, and then I'm going to go in the office next week, and then I'm going to be relocated to another location. And the company looks more like a network and less like a hierarchy every day. And certainly when I was at Deloitte, that was the way Deloitte operated. There was never an org chart at Deloitte I could ever find because it would be out of date the minute you created it. And I think more and more companies are like that. We still have levels and bosses, but you might have multiple bosses and multiple project teams. And so we need a generation of software that is agile and flexible enough to accommodate the actual way work gets done. And honestly, most of the ERPs are not designed that way. And most of the HCM systems were not designed that way. They're designed around the well-known hierarchical business structure. Bob does that. And Bob has this concept of groups and tribes of people, and not only does it do it for transactional purposes, but also for social purposes. And I think what's cool about what you guys have done is you understand that a lot of the energy that's created in a company is personal stuff. Mm-hmm. It's not how much I get paid. I mean, that's important, but it's knowing people and knowing something about their history, and somebody just had a baby, and who just had a birthday, and all that kind of stuff is actually a lot more important than the HR systems give it credit for, and you guys have respected all that. So not only do you have a system that's very agile from a structural standpoint, but I think it's agile from a social standpoint, and that's a huge leg up. The third area that I think is really important that you guys have done innovation in is in data. Most of the older HR technologies obviously have huge databases, and they collect all sorts of data. And what generally happened was they, at some point in their product evolution, said, let's build an analytics tool on top of the data we have. And so that, okay, we need a tool to create reports. Maybe we need something that does predictive analytics. So we'll put some, algorithmic recommendations in there. And then we'll pull data maybe in from an engagement survey. And so there are tools, but they're really not integrated platforms. And they're mostly tools to generate great reports. What you guys have done, as I understand it, is you've really thought about the data issues from the beginning. You've built the employee surveys into the system, not through an acquisition, but built in from the ground up. You have organizational network models, some very innovative predictive analytics that I just saw that I think are very unique, that I haven't seen anywhere else. Obviously, tools like engagement and sentiment analysis that managers can see directly. It's all built into the system. And I think this is one of the benefits you have of coming in from the outside and building an integrated solution. Because the traditional HCM market was analytics was a module that you bought separately after you bought everything else. So it was developed separately. Mm-hmm. And I think you guys have done a good job of building it all together.
Great. Pleasure talking to you.
Great. Thank you, Ronni.